So, Professor Max Farrar is a wonderful man. I've had the pleasure of meeting on a number of occasions. It's great to have him here. He is a extremely, I don't know where to begin, extremely well-rounded scholar. Yeah, and I would say an activist as well, if you don't mind me saying so.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, activist as well. Based in North Yorkshire in Leeds. He's currently Professor Emeritus at Leeds Beckett, is it called now?
We're now called Leeds Beckett.
Leeds
we
Beckett.
were once Leeds Metropolitan.
Leeds Beckett University. So he's going to talk to us about critical multiculturalism and the response to diverse Islamic beliefs and Muslim political positions. So I'm sure he's going to have lots to say, which is a great platform for discussion. So I'm going to ask Max to maybe get through his paper within 30-35 minutes, which still gives us 15-20 minutes or so for discussion before 4:30.
Oh yes, sorry.
Beyond 4:30, great. If anybody wants to leave at 4:30, then absolutely welcome. Right. So with that, I'll pass it on to Max, and I'll talk to you with 5-10 minutes to go.
Sure,
right.
sure.
You guys want to come round?
The closer the better.
Closer to that. Yeah, come. They're scared.
It's fine, it's fine. One more apology. I don't know if Ali Reza has told you this. I was sitting on the platform for 20 minutes waiting for the train and got my computer out, doing a few things like you do, looked up, train was going. I would have been here on time had I not been so stupid as to bury myself. You know how you do? This is the trouble with these computers and social media. You put your head down and the world disappears. So that's a lesson for me and probably for everyone else. I have got here a long paper, which the way I do these sorts of things, I'm retired. I'm a sociologist. For half my working life, I was a sociologist in a polytechnic, and then it became a university. And my other half of my working life, I've done all kinds of other jobs. But my preferred way of doing these kinds of events is really just to speak. But the trouble is, if I start speaking, I might never stop. So I tend to write something, and then if people... Those flowers are lovely, but I can't see the lady who's hiding behind it. So, yeah, just so I can see everybody. Thank you. I know you weren't hiding. It's just that we're in the line of sight. So if what I'm saying is of interest to you, I will pass to your learned professor the written copy of this, and you can read it properly. I've just read it again on the train, and there are some errors that slightly need changing, but basically there is quite a long 7,000-word essay which is written to be spoken, so it's not like a heavy-duty academic essay. And what I was going to do was read one section of it just to fit in the 30 minutes or so that I knew I was allocated. What I think I'll do instead is talk for 25 minutes to these slides which I've prepared, which were just there so that it's just a bit easier for you to make notes, really. The theme, maybe I should go back to that, is an idea that I'm trying to develop, which I'm calling critical multiculturalism. And I'm trying to develop this as a discourse, as a way of thinking about what we in Britain call multiculturalism. And the background to developing this idea, this discourse, is that for the whole of my, really, since I was a teenager, I'm now 65, so probably for 50 years, I've been absorbed in what happens, you know, to put it really bluntly, what happens when white people take over other people's countries, South Asian countries, African countries, Caribbean countries, of course originally countries like the United States, taken over from the Native Americans, South America. Basically, as you all know, white Europeans, in their colonial and imperial history, stole these countries and dominated them, attempted to change them, and then, in the case of Britain, sucked back into their metropolitan country those colonial subjects. Some of your parents, perhaps, were among those people who were drawn to Britain in the post-war period, parents and grandparents, perhaps. And in the United States, of course, one huge you couldn't really call it migration, was slavery. The capturing of Africans and depositing them in plantations in the southern parts of the United States. From the age of when I was about 15, in the United States, the civil rights movement broke out. And I was mightily impressed by that, partly because I had I was lucky enough at the rather privileged school I was at to have a black friend. Having said that, when he told me he was black, I said, "You're not." And he said, "I am." I said, "You're not. You're Italian or Spanish or something." He said, "No, my granddad came from Trinidad." I was gobsmacked. You know, this guy was brown, but I didn't know that meant he was African heritage. Anyway, you learn quickly at 14, 13, whenever it was. And that sort of got me very interested in my stupidity, my ignorance, and what on earth had happened to him and his family. So for the next sort of 25 years or so, I was mainly engaged in these sorts of issues politically, as an activist, as a political activist. Eventually I needed to get a proper job, so I found a part-time job at the Polytechnic, and I had to teach something to earn my living, so I began to teach in what in those days was called race relations. And at the same time, I started talking to the Muslim guy who ran the local corner shop, and he taught me a lot about Pakistan. He was from the Northwest Frontier. He taught me a lot about Pakistan and the Northwest Frontier and the role of the British and other nationalities in there. So I got more and more interested, you know, maybe 20 years ago, in what was specific about Islamic history, particularly the South Asian version of Islamic history. So that's the context that got me going on this. And to cut to this bit, in the last 10 or 15 years, and I explain all this in the paper and you can read it if it's of interest. In the last 10, 15 years, just at the point when I began to think Britain was quite a reasonably settled multicultural society where people, tremendous amounts of racism still, but I could see my black friends and Asian friends, families growing up, making their way. Yes, all kinds of issues, all kinds of ignorant white people still around, but I began to feel, by the end of the 80s, I was beginning to feel kind of a little bit optimistic about multiculturalism beginning to work in Britain. As you know, there's the big controversy over Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, but more crucially, the 2001 atrocities in New York and Washington suddenly put Muslims, I mean, white people have no idea what all the various parts of the Asian communities are. They've got no idea at all about the specificities of Islam, but all they knew was that Al-Qaeda was somehow attached to Islam, somehow thought of being as a Muslim organization, and, well, not somehow, they did claim to be acting in the name of God, didn't they? So that suddenly put Muslim civilization, Muslim culture, Muslim theology and Muslim politics right in the center of everybody's thinking. And that's when multiculturalism started to fall apart in Britain. Because senior people who, right up to that point, had been very enthusiastic about multiculturalism, began to say, it's gone too far. These Muslims, they're a bit odd. They live in these exclusionary kind of communities. They're keeping themselves to themselves. They're not multicultural. They're somehow really different from us. Same people have been saying 5 years before, you know, these Muslims work hard, they've got lovely families, they're not a burden on the state, we admired them. I'm oversimplifying, but you know, those sorts of things were said. They're very politically passive, they're very quiet, they're no threat to us at all. But suddenly there's this terrible disturbance that takes place, and in popular discussion of Muslims in Britain. The one good thing that happened was that, it's not fully good, but it's better than it would have otherwise been, is that senior people in British society did know enough about multiculturalism, and they did know enough about Islam to say there's nothing actually wrong with Islam as such. It's just these peculiar people on the extreme wing. Now that's not the best thing to say, but it's better than kicking everybody into touch. And so I began to argue for multiculturalism, but in an improved form. In other words, to try and hang on to, because they were very dismissive. These senior people in Britain were very dismissive, became very critical in the sense of trying to jettison what multiculturalism had been saying up to that point. I, on the other hand, and various other people began to say, no, what we want is not less multiculturalism, we want more and a better form of multiculturalism. So this is the idea that I then began to push forward. And I'm going to go through this quite quickly and then come back to it and say how I think this relates to the particular issue that we've got in front of us today, how critical multiculturalism might offer an interpretation and understanding of Muslims, particularly in Britain. So there are 6 points in my sort of list of the characteristics of critical multiculturalism, and several of them endorse the work of other scholars who I have a great deal of respect for. So, Bhikkhu Parekh and a Jamaican sociologist, a British Jamaican sociologist called Stuart Hall, came up with an idea in the year 2000 of Britain as being best thought of as, this is the whole of the UK, to think of it as one community of communities that can embrace all those communities, and the differences between those communities can be respected. The second point that it works with is Professor Madood's notion that instead of thinking of integration, as an awful lot of multiculturalists had, as saying the minority communities must adapt to the dominant community, in other words, all the brown and black people should become more like the white people. Forgive me for being crude, but I'm just trying to make this simple, and especially Professor Madood is far too sophisticated and kind to put it quite as crudely as this. But that's what he's pointing out, that multiculturalism had hitherto assumed that basically people should change to be more like the dominant community. What Tariq Madood has argued is that all the communities must change in relation to one another. And that includes white-skinned people, of course now of whom do include Muslims, but in Britain. But you know, thinking of using white as a crude marker of the dominant culture, they too must undergo all kinds of cultural adjustments and changes. Now this is one of the things that I've then tried to sort of move the discourse on a little bit from its previous position. You probably remember, you might have even been in schools where this happened, where diversity, and you know, there's nothing wrong with this as a starting point, is celebrated. So when schools, you know, predominantly white schools, have a festival for Eid, say, or Diwali, or they bring some steel bands in to represent the Caribbean population or whatever, that kind of celebration of the various cultures that migrant peoples have brought to this country is a perfectly valid starting point for the multicultural settlement. But my argument has been that there's got to be quite a serious negotiation as well, because there are differences which are, it is necessary for us to debate and discuss between the various and among the various cultures. So fourthly, and I'm following a Canadian scholar called Will Kimlicka here, there has to be much more attention within what I'm calling critical multiculturalism to full rights, full, properly enforced social rights for all minorities. Now, to some extent, Britain's achieved that because the legislation is reasonably good on religion and ethnicity, but there's still a long way to go in making sure that it is actually practiced throughout the land in every institution. Fifthly, and this is a point that I'm trying to add on, is that for this to really work, everybody in every community has to feel that they can make a difference in civic life through political engagement. So it's an argument for an extension and deepening of democratic activity, a change. And in fact, South Asian people have, in my observation, been more engaged, say, in the political parties than people of African heritage have tended to be. So that's a step in the right direction. But my argument is for a much more decentralized kind of democracy, which would get people involved in civic life at the grassroots in a multicultural setting. So finally, the argument that I'm putting is that in addition to this kind of formal legal equality, there has to be a much greater degree of economic equality. We have to reverse the extreme widening of the gap between rich and poor, and the sort of ossification of the economic position of the people in the middle. So that's my kind of framework for this discussion. And in the bit that follows in the paper, I then go through each of these points in a little bit more detail, saying how it might apply to Islam. What I'm going to do, because I've probably got another 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is just read you this third section, and I might, if there's time, read you the sixth section, because it's the third section which is the more controversial bit, the more exciting bit. I'm going to read it off the screen because thank you very much for printing this off, but I changed it again on the way down, so I'm now going to. My other trauma this morning, well, two traumas, one completely self-imposed, missing the flipping train, but the other one was that my printer ran out of ink, as it always does whenever I have to print anything for a talk. Right. Okay, so here's section 3. This is partly to prove to you that I can write, as opposed to just talk. Right. So it begins, we need to become much more mature as a society about the need to discuss, even argue about, the cultural differences that exist among and between the communities that form the British Isles. One reason I think that multiculturalism made such progress here is that people, everyday people, realized quite soon that the differences among us were not insuperable. This is partly because so many cultural groups share the Abrahamic faiths as their foundations of their culture, and in essence, those faiths subscribe to very similar values. While religious practices vary in detail, and there are serious theological differences, those human values, as demonstrated in how people live their family lives, how they live as neighbours, soon came to be seen as very similar to the settled, largely white Brits. In fact, South Asian British citizens impressed their white and black neighbours with their diligence and dedication to family life, as well as their sheer hard work in making ends meet. When the theology and cultural history came to be examined by those of us interested in what used to be called race relations, it became clear that, among Muslims, the groups that Tariq Ramadan calls Salafist, traditionalists and literalists were just one among many tendencies within Islam. While both of those groups do seem rigid, and they, to me anyway, they do seem incapable, perhaps unwilling, to engage in interpretation, despite the irony that in refusing interpretation, they are actually making an interpretation. The fact that so many other sections of Muslims are flexible and able to think dynamically within and between the various theological frameworks provides a clear basis for what I recommend as the negotiation between and among the communities. But, to repeat, this does require the embracing of change by everyone. As soon as I make more controversial statements, such as implying perhaps that the Shia need to make changes to adjust to Sunnis and to Sufis and vice versa, we see how hard a task we are setting ourselves. Just as Protestants find it very hard to make any significant adjustments in relation to Catholics, and the African heritage churches coming out of the Pentecostal and Baptist traditions find it almost impossible to change in relation to the other Christian traditions, it is perhaps too much to ask Muslims to bend, particularly when faced with such hostility from parts of the non-Muslim world. But changing the shape of our cultures is required of us all in critical multiculturalism's view. Earlier in the paper, I've mentioned issues that must be negotiated that divide many communities of faith, such as homosexual rights, especially gay marriage, and the status of women within the faith's hierarchy. The Church of England has for years been racked with divisions on these issues, and for a while it looked as though the African Church of England would break with the white church on these matters. But it looks to me as an outsider that the Church of England's approach to these intense differences of view has been a model of negotiation based on respectful long-term, normally respectful long-term dialogue. Some consensus has recently been established, somehow avoiding the schism with their African cousins. There will have to be an equally prolonged and difficult debate between those of all religions and none who support gay rights and those Muslims who regard homosexuality as haram. Already lines of accommodation have emerged, most promising of which, in my opinion, is that it is only for God to judge the homosexual, not me. Another pressing issue for negotiation, and again this is controversial, is the status of women living in Western society. This is a huge issue which divides not only people within each faith group, but which divides the unbelievers as well. No longer does a simple pro or anti-feminist split summarize the situation. There's no time to discuss this fully here, but one point to make in the context of negotiating difference, which must always entail a search for points of agreement, is that feminists who campaign against the objectification and demeaning sexualization of women might find that they have more in common than they suspect with Muslim women who cover themselves not as an act of subjection to men, but in order to enhance their autonomy. Kesia Ali makes clear that Islam's position on women's status can be seen in her interpretation to be quite compatible with the recently established and still contested relative equality between men and women in the UK. The fact that she concludes that Islam places women as ontologically equal to men, but in the last instance as socially less favoured than men, and perhaps ultimately secondary to men, will only trouble people like me who seek complete equality between the genders. Lots of non-Muslim women and men would settle for that equal but socially different positioning of women. The representation of Islam as a religion in which women are utterly subservient to men is clearly an extreme example of the Orientalist discourse that has sullied East-West relations. The issue of equal treatment for women and gays is clearly controversial when Muslims connect with recent changes in British attitudes. How much more difficult it is to deal with issues of difference which are quite literally, life-threatening. An answer to the question of what to do in relation to the doctrines of violence that have emerged in recent years within Islam has to start with an analysis of the roots of that violent tendency, which we don't have time to do thoroughly today. I've tried to explain elsewhere that we are witnessing an atavistic, rigid interpretation of Islam attaching itself to a Western political methodology. The turn to violence by some Muslims reflects the use of assassination and bombing by extremists in Europe and America of the far left and the far right, usually attached to a political party. In the early part of the talk, which I haven't read to you, I say something which I've been saying in public for quite a long time, ever since the boys from Leeds, the young men from Leeds, attacked London in that atrocious way. I confess, as it were, to being on the edge of extreme revolutionary groups in the UK who also turned to violence. I say on the edge because I didn't join them, but I was swimming in the same sea as some of them. So I've always wanted Britain to face up to this long history, and America and all of the European countries had these revolutionary terrorist groups formed of white middle-class men like me and some women, who we somehow seem to have ruled out of the discussion of the current phase of violent jihad and its attraction to some misguided Muslim, particularly men, but interestingly, increasingly some women seem to be getting attracted to this. So that's why I make this point about, if we want to have this discussion properly, we've got to look at our own, as Westerners, as whites, we've got to look at our own history in this. Recently, we've seen how the violently political faction calling itself Islamic State has, in addition to aping Western methods of terror, adapted Hollywood production values to 21st century Western social media tools, even mirroring Westerners' obsession with violent video games. That the attraction to this tendency among Western Muslims has been enhanced by the act of extreme violence perpetrated by the American and British governments and their allies on Afghanistan and Iraq is at last widely recognized even by those who supported those invasions and who turned a blind eye to the war crimes that took place. The West might even ask itself if its 100-year output of cinematic violence, enhanced by 60 years of television violence, might have helped both perpetuate the adulation of machismo and even blur the boundaries between screen violence and the physical blood, injury and death that we're seeing, that people in the Middle East are experiencing now. This socio-political context has to form one of the major agenda items when the Islamists and the Western negotiators finally meet. In my view, little progress will be made until the West acknowledges its complicity in creating the terribly dangerous situation in which it finds itself and admits its mistakes. The West has set the context for the recent emergence of the violent jihadi tendency. But to make real progress in the debate, there are matters internal to Islam which also need consideration. Islam, like the other religions of the book, has internally differentiated itself several times, resulting in a variety of positions on all sorts of important ethical questions. One of these is the debate about the conditions under which violence is legitimate. The Prophet Muhammad's ethical prescriptions on warfare are rightly seen as the foundation of the Catholic Church's much later pronouncements on the conditions for a just war. War must always be seen as the worst solution to the problems humans make for themselves. But if it has to be conducted, full implementation of the Islam-inspired just war principles would ameliorate some of its worst features. War crimes by all sides in the recent wars have to be acknowledged and judicially punished. War crimes as set out in the criteria for the just war based on the Prophet's original prescriptions and applied, for instance, in the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War. But there is one specific argument within Islam which has to be addressed in this context. This is the doctrine of takfir, developed by the, I don't know quite how to say this, Kharejiites in the Kharijite in the 7th century Christian era, in the Christian calendar. This ruling, as you know, justifies the killing of Muslims by other Muslims who do not follow their interpretation of Islam on the grounds that those Muslims are infidel. Civilians may be murdered for the same reason. This doctrine was revived by the Wahhabis between 1803 and 1813, pursued by Takfir wa Hijra in Egypt in the 1970s, and after much debate, probably 5 or 6 years of debate in Peshawar, Ayman al-Zawahiri, as you know, the successor to Osama bin Laden as the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri persuaded Osama that the doctrine of takfir was a valid doctrine. Once Al-Qaeda adopted this position, the door was open for the attacks on the USA in 2001, on Madrid in 2004, and London in 2005, in which Muslims and non-Muslims were indiscriminately slaughtered and wounded. Now, along with a former Attorney General, I regard George Bush Sr.'s aerial bombardment of Saddam Hussein's retreating army after it had been defeated in Kuwait in 1991 as a war crime. Perhaps 10,000 soldiers who had surrendered and were therefore non-combatants were killed by American and Canadian airplanes attacking them in retreat. There's dispute over the numbers. When that was first announced, I remember seeing it on the TV and being sickened at the figure of 40,000 people were thought to have been slaughtered. Unquestionably a war crime. The Wikipedia is amazing. I know your tutors always tell you don't use Wikipedia, but believe me, it's it's absolutely wonderful. So Wikipedia tells you that some people say it's 10,000, some people say it's some thousand less. But there's no doubt that there was an aerial bombardment of retreating soldiers. Al-Qaeda's actions are equally heinous, of course. But in debating violence as an instrument of politics, the criminal actions of Western powers have to be on the table for discussion. In this debate, the faction of Muslims who defy all just war principles has to be confronted. Somehow my term here on the screen, the negotiation of diversity, doesn't capture the enormous challenge we have here. Immediately, Muslims and non-Muslims will say that it is morally impossible to negotiate with people whose methods include acts of terror. But, as Tony Blair's Chief of Staff has recently argued, in many of the periods of terrorism of the last 100 years, negotiation is exactly what has been undertaken. He gives a couple of examples. Not only must Islamic State be drawn into negotiation, but so much must the groups supporting Al-Qaeda, as well as the political wing of the Free Syrian Army, along with the leadership of the Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranian governments. In the abstract, I said I'd say a little bit more about this, but I haven't done because it was already getting too long. But the point I'm trying to make, and this is well beyond Britain and multiculturalism, but it's this strong point about recognizing difference and negotiating its contours. So clearly, one of the reasons why Islamic State has gained such traction is precisely because the new government in Iraq wasn't as inclusive as it should have been. In fact, it replicated Saddam Hussein's exclusionary practices, which was one of the reasons for the catastrophe in Iraq in the first place. So there is fault on every side in this, but the big point I'm trying to make is that society will only work if people are able to look each other in the eye, work out their differences, and search for their common ground. And in the final point that I'm going to make in this right now is that the common ground, it seems to me, which is not talked about enough, although, and I'm not his biggest supporter, Tony Blair did occasionally make these references, because Tony Blair was, unlike most British politicians, was willing to talk about faith and therefore Tony Blair was able to at least refer to some extent to the common features of the Abrahamic tradition. I'm not a believer, but I recognize that my own political and ethical position is basically founded in my Christian upbringing. And the values at the heart of those great faiths, clearly we, believers and non-believers, when they get back to basics, tend to believe in the same eternal values, the same eternal virtues of the good. And it seems to me that the one thing that we can contribute as people who are interested in faith, and in your case obviously practicing a faith, is to point out what we have in common, whereas the bitter history, and you know, everybody's to blame for this, but it was the Northern Europeans who started the Crusades. You know, the bitter history of this is the effort of one faith to suppress another. And then, of course, when communism comes along and eschews faith altogether, it then tries to suppress faith. So this effort to exclude and to suppress and to marginalize is the root of what goes wrong in society, and yet we do have, if we go back to basics, we do have a huge amount in common. And critical multiculturalism looks for all those things in common. It wants to add on, and the final section of this was a kind of socio-political argument about much greater degree of social, economic, and cultural and political equality. It seems to me that division is not just a matter of faith, it's a matter of class and economic wealth, and that needs to be addressed as well. So that was a bit of a rush, but we're trying to keep to time, and there's a bit of time for some questions. Thank you.
So we still have a good 15 minutes. Yeah. So questions and discussion, hopefully.
I have a question. I have a couple of questions. Let's see if I can do that.
Can I get your name?
Yeah, Hassan.
Hassan.
That's the name.
Hassan, hi.
Maybe I've not understood it completely, but it seems to me that the negotiation of diversity stems from a desire to see cultures to move towards more moral positions in a way. But Britain as a community of communities plays more to the idea that we don't need a negotiation, we can respect the communities and the positions they are now. So how do you reconcile the two?
Yeah, well, very good question, Hassan, thank you. This is the sort of play between celebration and certainly recognition, understanding, recognizing, commending, celebrating is the starting point. And I think multiculturalism assumed that that moral commitment would triumph. And as I say, for a good while, I did begin to think that it was, particularly when the law backed it up, and particularly when schools, I don't know what your experience in schools was, but when my children were going to school, they were exposed in a kind of slightly soggy, kind of watered down kind of way, but they were exposed to the great contributions of the different faith positions and the different cultures. So that's the celebration bit. What I'm trying to say is that what has become much more what has become more controversial is where some values that the majority community subscribes to, or as I keep saying, recently have begun to move towards, particularly around women and women's status and sexual rights. When those sorts of issues come on the table, and I keep emphasizing these are the same issues for all people of faith. This isn't actually this isn't particularly an Islamic issue. It's something that emerged quite a long time ago in the Church of England, for instance. When those kind of issues come up, you can clearly see that it's very difficult to just simply say, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that anybody here is homophobic, but it's very difficult to say that those homophobic people are to be celebrated. My argument here is that we need to settle down together and discuss what's actually at stake when people have different sexual practices. More interestingly, in many ways, is the issue of how women, and it's become extremely controversial for reasons that I can understand, but I think are rather pathetic. It's become extremely controversial for women to wear the scarf in Britain. It's against the law in France. You know, a modern European state that bans you from wearing a scarf. Now, I think that's much easier to debate because, as I said, you know, certainly in Kecia Ali's analysis, it's perfectly clear that there are lots and lots of common points for the broader European society and for Islam, where women's status, you know, there's not such great difference. And I don't think there's a lot of shifting to be done there, but there is a discussion to be had. And I have to say I'm unclear in my own mind to what extent these are moral issues, which is of course how the faith position would state, and to what extent they're just social issues, just what happens as society develops and makes different demands on people at work and in their democratic lives.
Yes, but in a sense, if you're going to bring to the table a negotiation between a faith position and another position, the only real basis you'd have to go on is a shared sense of morality, right? Like they can.
To have the negotiation, you would track back to a shared sense of morality,
yeah.
Which in the case of women has to be that you know, women are they're bodily inviolable, their integrity is exactly the same as men's. They're of ontological equal status, etc., etc. So I think that's why I think there is, you know, there's a lot. That wouldn't be quite such a tough one. I think the homosexuality one is the more difficult one.
Anybody else?
I'm a little bit...
Can I have your name? Do you mind?
Sorry, my name's Afroz.
Afroz, hi.
I'm a little bit puzzled as to how your concept of negotiating diversity differs from integration. Partly because you mentioned a lot of examples of Muslims needing to, or Islam needing to be negotiated in its difference, but you don't mention any examples of white culture needing to be negotiated. And also, I mean, I think you seem to be working with a presumption that, for instance, some of the things that you have identified as being key to this negotiation are sort of tenets in Islam that are perceived to be, or that are, I suppose, uncompromisingly different, and sort of, you know, that would. So, for example, you talk about the whole kind of concept of the queer ideology and sort of the dehumanization, I suppose, of individuals who do not abide by, you know, do not prescribe to your particular brand of faith, and that challenging that internally. And you sort of go with that presumption when actually internally it is being challenged.
It is being challenged by
Muslims generally, including sort of the Salafi community. So. Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, I do accept that. Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know. It didn't quite come across as though it seemed as though you were suggesting that this should take place without actually acknowledging that it does.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I should change that then. No, I see your point on that.
Yeah.
Were you going to say some more? Yeah, okay, right. Let me just make a note of that. No, I suppose what I was saying, really what I was trying to put on the table was the around takfir, the peculiarity of that, or the singularity of that doctrine being revived. And I hope you could see that the context in which I was discussing it was a context in which the West routinely slaughters innocent people. So I'm not for 1 minute pretending that, you know, this is a one-sided. The reference to the drone attacks and so on in the full paper. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute this is a kind of one-sided problem, and I will stress that it is rejected, and in fact, Osama's kind of rival in Peshawar, Azid, I think he's called, you know, fought strongly against that doctrine being adopted. So I'm well aware that this was highly controversial. But I wanted to put it in because it seems that that kind of I don't suppose people generally recognize that these sorts of doctrines emerge out of a process of intellectual and, for want of a better word, theological and political struggle within Islam, and do need to continually be contested. I mean, I very much doubt that the young men who are being drawn towards Islamic State right now have the slightest idea of the history of those kinds of debates. So I was just trying to open up that area, but I will improve that. To go back to your starting point about integration, I do think actually that integration is a goal that I would support. I'm not for assimilation, but I am for integration. But maybe I should do some examples, but I was stressing that, following Tariq Madood really, it's the second point up there, it is a two-way process. And maybe I should put some examples in of where white culture needs to negotiate. And I suppose the example that comes straight to mind is how we practice our family life, you know, which is clearly something which is the white culture, for want of a better word, you know, has lost the plot on. And I think I made a reference to, it's certainly one of the observations, you know, from my 20s onwards, I lived in a multicultural neighborhood and my kids grew up in a multicultural neighborhood, and the children that my kids preferred to play with were generally, in a pretty low-income multicultural neighborhood, were black and Asian kids, because they came from families which were more like their family than some of the white kids were coming from. So yeah, it's a good idea. I should insert that sort of understanding. But maybe you disagree with me about integration as a goal.
No, I don't disagree with integration as a goal overall. I do agree with Madood's concept of integration as a two-way process, and it's just that I was struggling to see how you're talking about negotiation of diversity as being a different concept, while at the same time it seemed a lot like because the examples that you gave were of the Muslim community needing to negotiate their diversity, but there were no examples of the other side. So there was no two-way, as it were.
Yeah. There's that you've exposed a kind of complacency there, which I will address. Thank you.
No, that's all right. But yeah, no, I mean, I do think that integration is, you know, it probably is a goal, but I also think that sometimes it's overstated. At times, people don't realize how integrated Muslims really are, and also I think that it's this whole sort of shared moral whatever is kind of, I don't know how to articulate it, but it's sort of presumed that there is a shared moral, you know, some kind of universal moral standard, when actually there isn't necessarily. So I think that it makes things a bit tricky. But,
yeah. I mean, I am a kind of cautious universalist, actually. I do think, I do think that we recognize very quickly what we have in common if we're given half a chance to do so. And I think we recognize it in our hearts as well as, you know, just watching what people do. Just as we look at any human face and we go, that's a human, you know, it's instant. When Columbus turned up in what are now called the West Indies, everybody said, hi, mate, nice to see you, you know, come and have a meal. And it went wrong a few years later when he and his people treated the native people so badly. But, you know, this idea that is often put up that humans always push back, I think is sometimes somehow overstated. I think humans in the right conditions embrace, because of at some deep level, what we know of each other's common features. But that's a little bit, I know that's tendentious, and very few people, I mean, even people of my political faith don't accept that.
A final question from everybody, Hassan? No? Go on then, Hassan.
A couple of points. One is...
No, one. Brief.
Okay.
We can stay, yeah.
Maybe others who want to go as well.
This takfiri thing, actually, I agree with you in terms of takfir as a concept in which it's espoused that, you know, if you don't agree with me, you're liable to die, whatever it might be. Obviously, it's not shared. But actually, there is a watered-down version that I think actually cuts to the core of one of the reasons behind the problem with multiculturalism in the UK, and that is the feeling, especially in Islam, I think generally in religion, of superiority over those who don't follow your faith. I think this idea that a Muslim, my relationship with a Muslim should be more advanced, and my position as a Muslim is more advanced than that of somebody who doesn't share my faith. It's a watered down version, but I think it exists, it's rampant, and it's reinforced again and again by the leadership. Can I ask a question?
Well, it was a good point to make, so go ahead.
The question is more the pragmatic problems with this. When you talk about negotiation, so on the one hand you have one culture which has sort of a leadership because it's within a political state, right? When it comes to Islam, on the other hand, the major problem is diversity, and the other is that leadership is very often external, if there at all. And in a sense, it's a double-edged sword in that because it's external and in many cases non-existent, it is away from the context that we're talking about here. And so a lot of the integration, the negotiation, the respect and diversity, as I see, is coming from the grassroots. So it won't take us 2,000 years like it's taken the Catholics to change their attitude towards gay people. I think it'll happen a lot quicker because it comes from the grassroots, because we'll very quickly disconnect with external sources of leadership. So maybe the negotiation is almost taking a step back because you're trying to bring everybody on the table, whereas what's happening in reality is that it's coming up. So how do you... what do you think?
Funny, I was having exactly the same conversation with my wife this morning, and I think putting it as a double-edged sword is very right. There is a problem of knowing how on earth and who with I might negotiate. And one of the reasons why I like assemblies like this is because it's the only time I can actually have this sort of conversation. I also agree that what happens in everyday life is well in advance of what you ever hear when the so-called leaders start to appear on Newsnight or wherever. And I always feel, gosh, everybody I know is light years ahead of this person on the screen. So no, I'm with you on this, and I think you're right. I think things will change in everyday life. The thing about a hierarchically organized society, and this is why I'm also for a very devolved democracy, is that given the excessively hierarchical society of ours, unless you do produce some leading figures, and I hope it's a diverse, and I hope it's both genders, and I hope they're equally respectful as, you know, as they, or they're as respectful as they can be, until those people appear in public life, it's very difficult for the kind of national debate to really get going, because us lot, you know, the whites, we don't know anything. And therefore we listen to these fools who appear on our telly and go, oh, all right, that's what Muslims think. Sorry, they're not fools, but you know, they're people who are often not as intellectually or even intellectually sophisticated, or even as kind of knowledgeable about everyday life in Britain as a lot of you guys are. I think you were going to ask something, but yeah, let everybody go, eh? Or, don't. I know Muslims are so polite. I know you probably think, oh, I bet I hadn't go in case he's offended. I'm not at all offended if you want to go.
So just a quick comment. I came in late. Maybe you addressed this issue, but I've been thinking that I come from the Middle East, and I think it's very ethnically and religiously diverse. And I'm thinking, you know, when ISIS started slaughtering people, there were communities I never heard of until they started slaughtering them. And I mean, isn't that a testament to the diversity in Arab Muslim countries? Not that integration has been complete over there, but that's a problem with the nation states, that they were never really functional. But I think there's more integration than we think.
Well, I mean, I am ignorant about this, but I have traveled in various bits of the Middle East, and I've visited Turkey several times, and I have definitely observed what you're saying. And, you know, in Jordan, to go into Christian churches in the company of Christians and to talk to them privately about whatever they are, 10% or 8% or something of the Jordanian, and how it works. And my next door neighbor is a young white woman who's just married a Jordanian Christian of the Orthodox tradition. So I talked to him a little bit about these sorts of things. So I'm very much with you on this issue of diversity, certainly historically in the Middle East. I mean, I only heard about the Alawites, for instance, when I was in Turkey sort of 4 or 5 years ago. And again, I read about this in Wikipedia because it's such a handy guide, and there's, you know, several pages on this. And actually I realized that the Alawites aren't just one group either. You know, there are some people who tend more towards Sunni versions of Islam, some who tend more to Shia versions of Islam, and as you rightly say, until people started getting interested in Syria, most people had never even heard of such a community. And I mean, I don't know if some of you probably will have read Ed Hussein's book, The Islamist, when he came out of HT. Did any of you read this? I mean, he became very, his book Tahrir, you know, he became completely immersed in an organization which I think probably does have a jihadi wing to it, but I know it denies that now. But you know, his account of being seduced into this particular faction, and then partly going to Saudi Arabia. He got a job in Saudi Arabia, and thinking he was going to Saudi Arabia to embrace the kind of Islam that he really wanted to embrace, and finding he was utterly dismayed at what he found in Saudi Arabia. And then he hopped over to Syria, expecting not really to like Syria because of the Alawites being in charge and it not being, you know, and he said, oh, I was much happier in Syria. And exactly the point he made about, you can say what you like, and all right, it's supposed to be a police state, but actually I could say what I like. My wife was much better treated here than she ever was in Saudi Arabia. It's a much more diverse country. So, you know, but you see, this is what's hard for, I mean, for everybody, but particularly for people like me. Unless you can find people to talk to or to good things to read, it's just very hard to know really what's going on. And, you know, academia is often not the best source of this, because academia is segmented, and you're taught in, I'm sure you're not taught here, but in general you're taught in rather sort of narrow boundaries. And you know, this doesn't help this process of negotiation and conversation that I'm talking about. just finally on this, I spent some time in Israel recently with some people who are now Israeli citizens and obviously Jews, but they were of Moroccan heritage. And his position on being an Arab Moroccan Jew was, I mean, it was fascinating, because he really, really, really strongly wants to make the case that all the peoples of the Middle East are Semites. You know, we share a common language, and he gave us a lecture on the connection between Hebrew and Arabic, you know, and he put the root words up, and I was with a bunch of students and it just went right over their heads. But, you know, his particular approach was, yes, there are differences, but, and he's ended up in Israel, but yes, there are differences, but actually we're Semites with the common Abrahamic core.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Max. Much appreciated.
Well, I'm really sorry to be so late.
Yeah, it's been normally these seminars we've got Islamicists.
Well, exactly. Thank you for having me. I'm such an outsider.
And people, those who are still here, look far more awake than they usually have when we've got a team theological philosophical. So it's been a success.
Thank you very much.
Great honor.
And thank you for your questions, and I will improve upon this. What was your name, by the way?